Modern Queen Tales presents Seed of Retribution. Chapter 1. It begins with the soil. The damp, black earth of the abandoned glass house clung to my fingernails as I dragged myself out of the shallow grave. Cold rain dripped through the shattered panes of the iron-domed roof, washing the dried blood from my face. I was Anabelle Abernathy, the sole survivor of the grandest house in the southern provinces, and I was dead to the world. 2 days ago, Tyrant Arden had ridden into our estate on a horse draped in gold-embroidered velvet. His soldiers carried iron torches. They burned my family's ancient archives, slaughtered our guards, and dragged my father to the courtyard flagstones. Arden had smiled, his teeth white and straight, as his executioner's axe severed my father's head. When they dragged me forward, I fought. A soldier's blade had sliced my throat, and they had tossed my body into the carriage with the other dead, dumping us in the deep ravines outside the capital city. But my heart kept beating. The shallow wound on my neck had sealed under a thick scab of dried blood and river silt. I had crawled through the brambles, guided by an ancient, instinctual pull, until I reached this forgotten sanctuary on the northern edge of the capital. I looked at my hands. They were raw, calloused, and caked in dark soil. My silk gown was shredded into gray rags. Yet, as I touched the floor of the glass house, a strange warmth surged through my palms. I could hear the silent, thrumming pulse of the roots beneath the stone floor. The earth spoke in a language of moisture, nitrogen, and dormant energy. I walked deeper into the glass house. It was a massive, subterranean vault, disguised by overgrown ivy on the surface. Shelves of blackened oak lined the stone walls, holding ceramic pots, brass stills, and hundreds of glass vials wrapped in dried straw. In the center of the room stood a stone table, upon which sat a leather-bound journal. I opened the book. The parchment was thick and yellowed, smelling of dried lavender and vinegar. It was the legacy of my maternal grandmother, a woman the court had dismissed as a simple herbalist before she vanished. The pages contained meticulous drawings of roots, petals, and seeds, alongside instructions for distillation, soil composition, and lethal dosage. Arden took my name, my wealth, and my family, I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves scraping against stone. I will take his breath. I realized then that political influence was a fragile shield. My father had relied on treaties, gold, and ancestral loyalties. All of it had shattered under the weight of Arden's iron boots. The soil, however, held a quiet, absolute power. A seed had no concern for armor, royal decrees, or castle walls. It grew in the dark, cracked the strongest stone, and fed on the decayed remains of kings. I gathered the tools left behind by my grandmother. I found a brass hand trowel, a pair of thick leather pruning gloves, and a silver pocket knife with a bone handle. I cleaned the rust from the blades using river sand and oil from a sealed jar. Next, I inspected the soil beds. The earth in this sanctuary was rich, black loam, enriched by decades of decaying organic matter. It was the perfect cradle for the seeds I carried in a small silk pouch tucked inside my stay's seeds my father had smuggled from the deep southern jungles before his death. I cleared the wild weeds from the central bed. My movements were deliberate and swift. I dug 3-inch trenches in the dirt, dropped the small, wrinkled black seeds of the Atropa belladonna into the soil, and covered them with a light layer of leaf mold. "Grow," I murmured, pressing my palms flat against the earth. An immediate, vibrant heat answered my touch. The soil vibrated. Within minutes, tiny, pale green shoots cracked the surface of the black dirt, reaching upward toward the dim light filtering through the glass dome. They grew with unnatural speed, fueled by the residual magic of the sanctuary and the intensity of my focus. I sat back on my heels, watching the leaves unfurl. My path was clear. I would not raise an army. I would not petition the neighboring kingdoms for aid. I would cultivate a silent, beautiful harvest, and I would feed it to the tyrant, one drop at a time. Chapter 2. The Greenhouse Arsenal. The glass house transformed over the next 3 months into a dense, suffocating jungle of lethal beauty. Under my constant care, the rare toxic flora flourished, their vibrant colors contrasting sharply with the gray stone walls of the vault. I spent my mornings pruning the digitalis purpurea foxglove. Its tall spikes of bell-shaped, speckled pink flowers looked identical to the harmless ornamental varieties that grew along the riverbanks. But these specimens had been fed on a diet of bone meal and mineral-rich ash, amplifying their concentration of cardiac glycosides. A single drop of their refined sap could slow a man's heart to a complete stop within 3 hours, mimicking a natural coronary failure. Beside the foxglove grew the aconitum, commonly known as wolfsbane. Its deep blue, helmet-shaped flowers were stunning to look at, but the roots contained aconitine, a fierce neurotoxin. I wore my heavy leather gloves whenever I worked near them. Even a small scratch from their roots could cause immediate numbness and cardiac arrhythmia. I set up my laboratory on the central stone table. The brass still was my primary tool. I heated water over a small coal brazier, distilling the leaves and roots to extract their pure, concentrated essences. I sliced the thick, tuberous roots of the wolfsbane with my silver pocket knife. The flesh of the root was white and crisp, smelling faintly of horseradish. I placed the slices into a copper beaker, added pure grain alcohol, and left it to steep. Over several days, the liquid turned a pale amber color. Using a glass pipette, I transferred the amber liquid into a small vial. This was my paralytic. In small doses, it would cause a temporary loss of motor control. In a larger dose, it would paralyze the diaphragm, causing asphyxiation while the victim remained fully conscious. My most prized creation was a hybrid jasmine vine. I had cross-pollinated a native white jasmine with a rare, night-blooming vine from the eastern swamps. The resulting flowers were pure, milky white, star-shaped, and produced a scent so sweet it made the head spin. But the nectar of these blossoms contained a high concentration of an untraceable narcotic. The vapor alone, when inhaled in a closed space over several hours, would cause a deep, irreversible sleep. I tested the potency of my poisons on the common field mice that nested in the corners of the glass house. I placed a single drop of the distilled foxglove extract onto a piece of dried apple. A fat, gray mouse scurried out and ate the fruit. I watched it closely. For 20 minutes, it behaved normally, foraging through the straw. Then, its movements slowed. It sat down, blinked twice, and tipped over onto its side. There were no convulsions, no blood, and no signs of distress. It looked as though it had simply fallen asleep. "Perfect," I whispered. The palace employed 12 food tasters, each trained to recognize the metallic tang of arsenic or the bitter burn of hemlock. My extracts were different. They were tasteless, odorless, and completely integrated into the natural compounds of the plants. They would slip past the tasters like water. I prepared my disguise. I cut my long, dark hair with the silver knife, leaving it in a short, practical crop that fell around my ears. I scrubbed my face with charcoal ash to dim the paleness of my skin and donned the rough, undyed wool trousers and linen tunic of a common laborer. I filled a sturdy wicker basket with harmless, beautiful specimens from my garden, sweet-scented geraniums, vibrant blue delphiniums, and pots of perfectly cultivated winter roses. Hidden beneath the double wicker bottom of the basket were 6 small glass vials, each containing a different, deadly concentrate. I slung the basket over my shoulder. The weight of the wicker strap pressed into my collarbone, a solid, grounding reminder of my purpose. I walked out of the glass house, locking the heavy iron door behind me, and set my eyes on the spires of the royal palace rising above the city walls. Chapter 3. Infiltrating the Inner Circle. The royal nursery was a bustling hive of activity located on the southern terrace of the palace. The air smelled of wet clay, fertilizer, and the heavy scent of lilies. I secured a position as an undergardener by presenting a pot of my winter roses to the head steward, Master Joseph. The roses were a marvel. Their petals were a deep, velvety crimson, and they bloomed despite the frost on the ground. Joseph, a bald man with a round belly and spectacles perched on the tip of his nose, had gasped when he saw them. "Unbelievable," Joseph had muttered, running a thick finger over a leaf. "How did you get them to bloom in this cold?" "A special soil mixture, sir," I said, keeping my head bowed and my voice low, adopting the flat, nasal accent of the southern peasantry, and a bit of willow bark water to keep the roots warm. He hired me on the spot, assigning me to the lowest chores, hauling soil, scrubbing terracotta pots, and weeding the gravel paths. It was exactly what I wanted. It allowed me to move through the palace grounds without drawing the attention of the guards. To them, I was just another faceless servant in mud-splattered trousers. Over the next month, I observed the palace's daily rhythm. I identified the key figures who kept Arden's regime running with iron efficiency. First was Commander Valcan, the head of the Royal Guard. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He was brutal, prone to beating servants for the slightest infraction, and fiercely loyal to the tyrant. He oversaw the executions and the tax collections. Second was Chancellor Cornwall, a thin, pale man who managed the kingdom's treasury. He was the one who had signed the decree to seize my family's estates. He spent his afternoons in the sun-drenched registry office on the second floor, reviewing ledgers and drinking cups of imported mint tea. And then there was Arden himself. He rarely appeared in the public gardens, spending his time in the high tower or the private inner courtyard, protected by triple rings of guards. I began my work. I was assigned to plant winter ivy along the walls of the inner courtyard, right outside Commander Valcan's private quarters. The courtyard was a paved stone square with a central fountain. While the guards patrolled the ramparts above, I worked diligently on my knees. I dug up the packed earth along the stone borders. Among the harmless ivy, I planted the seeds of the creeping nightshade I had cultivated. The seeds were coated in a special growth accelerant. Within days, they would sprout, climbing the stone walls and weaving through the iron grates of Valcan's low window. I also targeted Chancellor Cornwall. I noticed that he had a habit of rubbing his fingers together when he was stressed, and he frequently touched the pages of his ledgers. He also insisted on having fresh lavender placed in his office every morning to combat his chronic headaches. I volunteered for the duty of delivering the fresh herbs to the administrative wing. The guards at the entrance of the registry office barely looked at me as I passed, carrying a bundle of purple stalks. "Leave it on the side table," one of the guards ordered, gesturing with his spear. "Yes, my lord," I murmured. I set the bundle down. Hidden within the lavender stalks were dried, crushed leaves of wolfsbane. I had treated the leaves with a volatile oil that would slowly evaporate in the warm air of the office. The vapor was invisible, but as Cornwall sat at his desk, breathing it in hour after hour, the aconitine would slowly enter his bloodstream through his lungs, causing his chest to tighten and his limbs to grow heavy. Every evening, I returned to my hidden sanctuary to prepare more doses. My hands were stained yellow from the pollen of my creations, but my heart was light. The pieces of the board were moving into place. The tyrant's inner circle was surrounded by my silent, growing army. Chapter 4. A Symphony of Petals. The first movement of my symphony began on a chilly Tuesday morning. Commander Valkan walked out into the inner courtyard to inspect the morning guard change. The creeping nightshade had grown beautifully over his window, its dark green leaves and small purple flowers framing the glass. I was kneeling near the fountain, pretending to scrub the limestone basin. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched him. Valkan stopped, reaching out to brush aside a long vine of the nightshade that was obstructing his view of the courtyard. His bare hand made direct contact with the leaves. I had coated the undersides of those specific leaves with a highly concentrated, oil-soluble extract of wolfsbane mixed with DMSO, a natural compound that accelerated absorption through the skin. It was a contact poison of terrifying speed. Valkan rubbed his palm against his tunic, continuing his walk across the courtyard. Within 10 paces, his gait became uneven. He stumbled, his hand flying to his throat. "What? What is this?" he muttered, his voice thick and slurred. The guards rushed to his side. "Commander, what is wrong?" Valkan tried to speak, but his facial muscles were already paralyzed. His jaw hung slack. He collapsed onto the gravel, his legs twitching as the neurotoxin shut down his nervous system. Within 2 minutes, his breathing stopped entirely. "An apoplexy!" the physician screamed when he arrived, examining the commander's purple face. His heart simply failed. It was a sudden seizure of the blood. I kept my head down, scrubbing the stone basin. A cold, hard satisfaction bloomed in my chest. 2 days later, it was Chancellor Cornwall's turn. The office of the Treasury was closed for the morning, but the servants whispered of the tragedy that had occurred during the night. Cornwall had been found slumped over his desk, his fingers still gripping a silver quill. His lungs were filled with fluid, and he had suffocated in his sleep. The royal physicians were baffled. There were no marks on his body, no signs of struggle, and his food tasters had survived the evening meal without incident. "A sudden, violent asthma," the head physician declared to the panicked court. "The damp air of the autumn has settled in his chest." Paranoia began to spread through the palace like a rot. With the commander of the guard and the chancellor of the treasury dead within 48 hours, the remaining ministers grew terrified. They doubled their personal guards, refused to eat anything but boiled eggs shell-cracked at their own tables, and locked themselves in their chambers. But they did not suspect the flowers. I decided to amplify their terror. I began to place specific floral arrangements in the corridors where the remaining ministers walked. In the hallway leading to the Great Hall, I placed large vases filled with deep orange lilies and white carnations. It was a traditional funerary arrangement in the southern provinces, the exact flowers that had decorated my father's memorial before the tyrant destroyed it. I also added a subtle chemical element to the water in the vases. I added a drop of an organic compound that, when combined with the scent of the lilies, created a sharp, metallic undertone. It smelled exactly like fresh blood. I watched from the shadows of the gallery as the Minister of War, Lord Gregory, walked down the hallway. He was accompanied by 4 guards with drawn swords. As he approached the vases, he stopped. He sniffed the air, his face turning pale. "Do you smell that?" Gregory whispered, his eyes darting to the lilies. "Smell what, my lord?" the guard asked. "Blood. It smells of blood and funeral lilies." Gregory rubbed his temples, his hands trembling. Remove these flowers! Remove them at once! Yes, my lord. But the scent lingered in their minds. The palace was no longer a fortress. It was a gilded cage filled with invisible ghosts. Every sweet scent became a threat. Every petal was a potential blade. I stood in the garden, holding a basket of fresh jasmine. The tyrant was now isolated. His strongest shields were gone, and his mind was fracturing under the weight of an unseen enemy. It was time for the final act. Chapter 5. The Jasmine Execution. The royal glass house was Arden's private sanctuary. It was a massive circular structure of glass and gilded iron, located at the highest point of the palace gardens. Here, the tyrant spent his evenings seeking solace from the mounting terror that gripped his court. The night air was cold and crisp, but inside the glass house, the atmosphere was warm and heavy. The air was thick with the scent of tropical ferns, orchids, and the massive, climbing jasmine vine I had cultivated over the past month. I had volunteered to tend the glass house during the evening hours, bribing the old night watchman with a flask of spiced wine. The guards at the outer gates knew me now. They let me pass with a simple nod, convinced I was nothing more than a quiet, hard-working mute. I stood in the shadows of a large palm tree, watching Arden. He was sitting in a high-backed wicker chair in the center of the glass house. He looked different from the confident conqueror who had ridden into my family's courtyard. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. A bottle of wine and a single silver goblet sat on the table beside him, but he had not touched them. He was terrified of being poisoned. "Who is there?" Arden called out, his voice sharp and defensive, as he heard the rustle of a palm frond. I stepped out of the shadows. I had removed my gardener's apron. I wore a simple dark green linen gown that fit close to my body. In my hand, I carried a single, perfect, white jasmine flower. "Just the gardener, Your Grace," I said. My voice was no longer flat and peasant-like. It was clear, resonant, and cold. Arden frowned, squinting through the dim light of the oil lamps. Your voice. You are not the mute boy." "No," I said, walking slowly toward him. "I am Anabelle Abernathy." He gasped, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled. He fell back into the wicker chair, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What have you done to me?" he hissed, his hand trembling on the armrest. "My guards! They cannot hear you, Arden," I said, stopping a few feet from him. "The glass is thick, and the doors are sealed from the inside." He tried to draw his sword, but his fingers lacked the strength to grip the hilt. The silver blade slipped from his grasp, clattering against the stone floor. "You feel heavy, do you not?" I asked, my voice soft, almost conversational. "Your limbs feel as though they are made of lead. Your chest is tight, and your vision is beginning to blur at the edges." "The wine," he muttered, staring at the untouched bottle. "I did not drink the wine." "No, you did not," I agreed, pointing up to the massive dome of the glass house. Above us, the hybrid jasmine vine hung in thick, heavy garlands, its thousands of white, star-shaped flowers fully open in the night air. The heat of the glass house, combined with the oil lamps, had caused the plant to release an immense volume of its toxic vapor. "The air itself is your executioner, Arden," I said. "Every breath you have taken for the past hour has filled your lungs with the refined nectar of my southern jasmine. It is a beautiful way to die, is it not? No blood, no steel, just a quiet, eternal sleep." Arden stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and realization. You killed Valkan. You killed Cornwall." "I reclaimed my family's honor," I corrected him. You took everything from us. You slaughtered my father, burned our history, and left me for dead in a ditch. But you forgot that the Abernathys have always been keepers of the earth. We know what lies beneath the soil, and we know how to harvest it. He attempted to crawl out of the chair, dragging his useless legs along the floor. He managed to move a few inches before collapsing onto his stomach, his face resting against the cool stone. I knelt beside him. I reached out and placed the single white jasmine flower next to his cheek. The sweet, overpowering scent filled the small space between us. "This is for my father," I whispered. Arden let out a long, shuddering sigh. His eyes rolled back, the pupils dilating until they were completely black. His chest rose one last time, held, and then sank, staying still. I stood up. I felt no regret, no guilt, only a deep, clean sense of completion. The tyrant was dead, and his empire of iron would crumble without its head. I walked to the outer doors of the glass house. I unlocked them using the key I had taken from the watchman, stepping out into the cool, fresh night air. The stars were bright and clear above the palace spires. I walked down the stone steps, through the dark garden paths, and out of the palace gates. I left the city behind, heading toward the northern hills, where my hidden sanctuary awaited. The garden would continue to grow. The roots of my flowers would reach deep into the earth, reclaiming the stone and the iron of the palace, burying the old regime beneath a blanket of silent, beautiful green. I was Anabelle Abernathy, and I had delivered my harvest. The end.
If you enjoyed this quick escape, hit the subscribe button for new stories twice a week. Until then, I'll see you at the next flip of the pages.